I want you to take a moment and picture this, a missile barrage described as the most violent to date, raining down on the very heart of Jerusalem. Not just any location, but the municipal compound, the symbolic center of governance, authority, and civic life. When a strike targets such a nerve center, it isn't merely about destruction of property. It's a message, an undeniable statement carved into steel. Fire. Let us take a deep breath and consider what it truly means when analysts describe the recent Yemeni missile attack on Jerusalem as an escalation of conflict. Words like escalation are often repeated in news cycles, but too rarely do we pause to reflect on what they signify, both in lived reality and in political consequence. An escalation is not just an increase in numbers, not simply more missiles launched or louder explosions heard. Escalation is when the very character of a conflict changes, when the geography of vulnerability expands, when the stakes rise to a new level, and when the confidence of governments and citizens alike begins to erode under the pressure of uncertainty. The strike on the municipal compound in Jerusalem is not just another missile, it is a symbolic breach, a deliberate reminder that the center of power can be touched. And when centers of power are vulnerable, the rules of the game shift dramatically. Think of it this way: for years, the war in Yemen was framed by many as distant, localized, and asymmetrical. Yemen, battered by blockade, famine, and poverty, was portrayed as the weaker side. Israel, by contrast, with its advanced missile defense systems and powerful allies, appeared insulated from that kind of direct threat. But when we now see missiles bypassing those very layers of security and landing at the heart of Jerusalem, the illusion of imbalance begins to fracture. Suddenly, escalation becomes not only a military reality, but a psychological one. Citizens who once believed the war was out there are now forced to live with the possibility that it can arrive uninvited into the very center of their civic life. And that shift in perception, that fear that no place is untouchable, is in many ways more destabilizing than the physical destruction itself. Here's the hook: escalation is not measured only by firepower, but by the size of the questions it forces us to confront. What does it mean when a government can no longer guarantee the safety of its own symbolic institutions? What does it mean when a country under siege, long written off as desperate and weak, proves capable of striking the nerve centers of a much stronger adversary? These questions linger long after the smoke clears, and they unsettle the very foundations of national confidence. At the same time, escalation creates ripple effects across the regional chessboard. Neighboring states watch closely because an attack of this magnitude is never interpreted as an isolated act. It becomes precedent. If Yemen can reach Jerusalem, what does that mean for the calculus of others in the region? What adjustments must be made to military doctrines, to diplomatic alliances, to the delicate balancing act that defines Middle Eastern geopolitics? Each missile, each strike becomes not just a battle in itself, but a rehearsal for what might come next. And escalation ensures that what comes next is always more unpredictable, more dangerous, and more costly. But let us not overlook the human dimension. Escalation is also experienced in the minds and lives of ordinary people. In Jerusalem, families wake up to the sound of sirens and the images of their municipal compound in ruins. In Yemen, families watch the global headlines and see their struggle translated into the language of power, not suffering. For them, escalation represents a validation of sacrifice, a proof that despite overwhelming odds, their resistance cannot be ignored. And here is another hook worth reflecting on. When suffering transforms into symbolic power, the dynamics of war can no longer be contained by conventional strategies. You are no longer just fighting a military opponent. You are confronting a narrative, a collective identity forged in hardship, and those are forces that missiles alone cannot silence. Escalation also disrupts the fragile balance between diplomacy and violence. Before such a strike, the conversation might still leave room for negotiation, for back channel talks, for political compromise. After the strike, however, governments feel pressure to respond, to demonstrate strength, to assure their citizens that they remain in control. Escalation forces leaders into a corner. To do nothing risks appearing weak, but to retaliate risks deepening the cycle of destruction. And this is the cruel paradox of escalation. It narrows the options available to policymakers while expanding the consequences for everyone else. Perhaps most dangerously, escalation feeds on itself. A missile barrage today provokes a counterstrike tomorrow, which in turn provokes retaliation the day after. Each round builds on the last until the conflict assumes a momentum of its own, difficult to pause, let alone reverse. This is why understanding escalation matters, because it is not simply an episode, but a trajectory. Once begun, it points us toward futures more violent, more chaotic, and harder to control. And unless we ask the hard questions now, questions about justice, about inequality, about the roots of this violence, we will find ourselves watching escalation unfold again and again, each time more devastating than the last. So when we say the Yemeni missile barrage against the municipal compound in Jerusalem represents an escalation, let us understand fully what is at stake. It is not only the damage to a building or the success of a military strike. It is the transformation of perception, the destabilization of political authority, the shaking of regional power, the fueling of cycles that move us further from peace and closer to catastrophe. That is the weight of escalation, and that is why this moment demands our closest attention. When analysts and commentators describe the Yemeni missile strike on Jerusalem as an escalation, it is important to recognize that we are not simply talking about more missiles or larger explosions. Escalation is a profound shift in the nature of the conflict. It represents a moment when the struggle crosses new thresholds, when the theater of war widens, and when the security assumptions that citizens and leaders once relied upon are suddenly shattered. A missile barrage aimed at Jerusalem's municipal compound, the symbolic nerve center of governance, changes the perception of safety in the region. For the first time in this conflict, it is not only military targets that are being tested, but also the authority, legitimacy, and confidence of a state that has long projected strength and stability. Here is where the hook comes in. Escalation is not just about what happens on the battlefield. It is about the size of the questions that follow. If missiles can reach the municipal compound in the heart of Jerusalem, then what else is possible? What does it say about the effectiveness of the much vaunted defense systems? What does it say about the credibility of promises made by leaders to protect their citizens? These are not abstract questions. They strike at the very psychology of a population now, forced to consider the possibility that even their most secure spaces are within reach of their enemies. Fear of the unknown is often more destabilizing than the damage of the strike itself. Escalation also forces a recalibration of power dynamics. For years, the conventional wisdom was that Yemen, starved of resources and crippled by economic blockades, could never project power deep into Israel's heart. The conflict was seen as asymmetrical, a fight between a weak nation and a regional powerhouse backed by global allies. But when Yemen demonstrates the capacity to send missiles into Jerusalem, that narrative collapses. Suddenly, asymmetry does not guarantee predictability. Suddenly, the weaker party is capable of redefining the battlefield. This is escalation not only in military terms, but in symbolic terms, the weak reminding the strong that their power has limits. Another layer of escalation emerges in the regional context. Neighboring states watch events like this with unease because each strike sets a precedent. If Yemen can target Jerusalem, what does this mean for the broader balance of power in the Middle East? How do other governments interpret the limits of defense systems? How do alliances adjust when the impossible suddenly becomes possible? Escalation, in this sense, is not contained to one incident, it is contagious. It spreads across borders, reshaping calculations in capitals far beyond the immediate blast zone. For ordinary citizens, escalation is experienced in daily life. In Jerusalem, people wake to sirens and witness damage to the very structures that symbolize order and governance. They internalize the message that their leaders may not be able to protect them. In Yemen, escalation is interpreted as vindication. After years of suffering under siege, famine, and bombardment, the ability to strike Jerusalem resonates as proof of resilience and defiance. And here lies another hook. Escalation is not simply a military event, it is a narrative weapon. It communicates strength where there should be weakness and vulnerability where there should be security. Once that message is out, no government can easily control it. Escalation also alters the diplomatic terrain. Before such a strike, there may still be space for negotiation, for quiet talks behind closed doors, for compromises that de-escalate tension. After such a strike, however, leaders feel compelled to respond with force, to demonstrate control, to reassure their citizens. Escalation narrows political options. It creates a dilemma. Inaction risks appearing weak, but retaliation risks inflaming the conflict further. The space for diplomacy shrinks while the space for violence expands. That is the cruel arithmetic of escalation. Perhaps most dangerously, escalation tends to feed on itself. One barrage leads to retaliation, which leads to further attacks, creating a momentum that becomes difficult to stop. Each side feels compelled to outdo the other, to demonstrate strength, to avoid the appearance of defeat. In this way, escalation is not a moment, but a trajectory, a spiral that points toward greater instability, greater suffering, and greater loss. And unless the deeper causes, economic deprivation, political exclusion, historical grievance, are addressed, escalation becomes the default path forward. So when we call this Yemeni missile strike on Jerusalem an escalation, let us recognize the full weight of that term. It is not only the destruction of a municipal compound, but the transformation of perception, the disruption of power, the spread of fear, and the narrowing of peaceful solutions. It is the moment when a conflict crosses into new territory, forcing everyone, leaders, citizens, allies, and rivals alike, to rethink what comes next. That is the true danger of escalation. It raises the stakes while lowering the chances of resolution, pulling us deeper into cycles that are far easier to ignite than they are to end. When missiles strike a city, the immediate images we see are of destruction. Twisted metal, shattered glass, emergency sirens piercing the night. But the deeper consequence is not always visible. It is psychological. It is the slow erosion of a population's sense of safety. When Yemeni missiles landed in the heart of Jerusalem, targeting the municipal compound, the physical damage was measurable, but the shock waves that traveled through the minds of ordinary people were far greater. Escalation on this level is not just about weapons breaching defenses, it is about fear breaching certainty. And once that fear takes hold, it alters everything, how people live, how governments respond, and how the conflict itself is understood. Here is where the hook comes in. The true power of such a strike lies not in the rubble it creates, but in the questions it plants. If a missile can fall on the municipal compound, can it also fall on schools, on hospitals, on marketplaces? If even the very seat of governance is vulnerable, where is safe? Citizens do not need to experience the strike directly. The idea that their most secure places can be touched is enough to change behavior. Parents keep children closer to home, businesses shutter earlier, gatherings shrink in size. The missile becomes not just an explosive device, but a psychological weapon, spreading uncertainty faster than fire. For a government, this psychological impact can be far more dangerous than the physical one. Buildings can be rebuilt, shattered glass can be replaced. But once the bond of trust between the state and its citizens is weakened, it is not easily restored. Governments survive not only by wielding power, but by convincing their people that order, stability, and security are within reach. A strike at the symbolic heart of Jerusalem calls that promise into question, and when citizens begin to doubt that their leaders can protect them, cracks appear in the foundation of political legitimacy. It is important to recognize that this psychological impact is not confined to Israel. In Yemen, the same event is interpreted very differently for Yemeni citizens, many of whom have endured years of bombardment, blockade, and famine. Watching images of missiles striking Jerusalem creates a sense of empowerment. The message they receive is that their struggle is not futile, that their suffering has been transformed into the capacity to reach the heart of their adversary, and that feeling, that perception of strength in the face of overwhelming odds is a powerful motivator. Here is another hook worth considering. While one side experiences vulnerability, the other experiences validation. That is the dual psychology of war, and it fuels cycles that become increasingly difficult to break. Psychological impact also reverberates in the international sphere. Allies and adversaries alike watch with careful attention. For Israel's allies, the strike raises uncomfortable questions. If their partner cannot shield its most central civic institutions, what does this say about the effectiveness of the vast resources poured into defense systems? For Israel's adversaries, the message is different. Persistence and endurance, even under crushing hardship, can yield results. Thus, one event in Jerusalem alters perceptions not just locally but globally. And here lies another dimension of the psychological battle. Escalation reshapes the narrative. Before the strike, the story might be one of overwhelming strength against desperate resistance. After the strike, the story becomes one of resilience breaching superiority. Narratives matter because they define how conflicts are remembered, how they are justified, and how future generations interpret them. A single missile barrage cannot win a war, but it can redefine how the war is perceived, and that perception can prove just as decisive as firepower. There is also the everyday psychology of living under threat, a society that feels constantly exposed, where the line between safety and danger blurs, becomes tense, fragmented, and less resilient. Stress multiplies, mistrust deepens, and divisions widen. Citizens begin to look for blame, sometimes at external enemies, but often at their own leaders. And when confidence in leadership falters, the ground is laid for political instability at home, even as the war rages abroad. So when we reflect on this most violent missile barrage, we must see beyond the immediate blast zone. The deeper significance lies in the invisible wounds it leaves on collective consciousness. The missile is a weapon of destruction, but also a weapon of doubt, of fear, of narrative power. It challenges not only defenses of steel and technology, but the defenses of psychology and belief that hold societies together. And once those defenses are breached, no government can claim true security, no matter how strong its arsenal may be. When a missile lands on a military base, the world sees it as an act of war. But when a missile strikes a municipal compound, the meaning runs deeper. The municipal compound is not just brick and stone, it is a symbol. It represents governance, authority, the ability of a state to organize, regulate, and provide structure to society. It is where policies are signed into law, where officials gather, where the mechanics of civic life are managed. To strike at such a place is to strike at the very idea of order itself. And that is what makes this latest Yemeni barrage so significant. It was not aimed at destroying tanks, planes, or barracks, but at shaking the legitimacy of the state in the eyes of its own people. Here is a hook worth pausing on, and physical destruction can be repaired, but symbolic destruction leaves a wound that lingers. A building can be reconstructed in months, but the image of missiles tearing through the seat of government cannot be erased from memory. It circulates in media, in conversations, in the imaginations of those who lived through it. And every time it is recalled, it reinforces the sense that no place is safe, not even the heart of governance. The strike becomes a story, and in war, stories carry power equal to that of weapons. Consider the psychology of symbolism. A municipal compound represents stability, the everyday rhythm of bureaucracy, the hum of paperwork and governance that, though often invisible, keeps society functioning. People expect the military to be targeted in war. They do not expect the symbolic centers of civic life to be turned into battlegrounds. The disruption of that expectation sends shock waves through the public. Suddenly, the war is not at the borders, not on the periphery, but embedded in the very structures that define community and order. This changes how citizens see their government and how they see their future. For the attackers, symbolism is deliberate strategy. Yemen is not merely trying to cause damage, it is trying to communicate. The message is that the conflict is not confined to military installations, that resistance can penetrate the heart of power, that no symbol of authority is beyond reach. Here is another hook in modern conflicts. The symbolic value of a target can outweigh its strategic value. A single strike on a symbolic site can shift narratives more than a dozen strikes on purely military ones. This is why the municipal compound matters. The symbolism also resonates far beyond Jerusalem. Regional actors interpret it as a test of Israel's ability to protect its own symbols of governance. Allies worry about the precedent. If Jerusalem can be reached, what about Tel Aviv? What about other cities considered untouchable? Rivals, on the other hand, see opportunity. They see that the war is not only about missiles and defense systems, but about undermining confidence, shaking legitimacy, and destabilizing order. And once that door is opened, others will be tempted to push further. At the same time, symbolism cuts both ways. For Yemeni citizens who have endured unimaginable suffering, the strike carries the meaning of empowerment. To them, it is proof that even a weakened, blockaded nation can send a message to the world. It affirms resilience. It transforms the narrative from one of victimhood to one of agency. For a population often overlooked, this symbolism is a source of pride, even as the costs of war weigh heavily on them. Governments understand the danger of symbolic strikes, which is why they are often quick to downplay damage or highlight rapid reconstruction. They know that symbols hold power and that the perception of vulnerability can be more damaging than the vulnerability itself. Yet here lies the challenge. Once a symbol has been violated, no amount of reconstruction can erase the fact that it was once breached. The municipal compound will forever carry that memory, no matter how polished its new walls may look. And this is the essence of why symbolic strikes matter in modern warfare. They reshape the battlefield without moving a single soldier. They weaken authority without collapsing infrastructure. They sow doubt without firing more than a handful of weapons. That is the power of symbolism in conflict. It amplifies the psychological and political consequences of violence far beyond the physical blast radius. So when we analyze this particular barrage, we must recognize that the target was chosen not only for what it is, but for what it represents. The municipal compound is governance, order, authority, and stability. Striking it was not just a tactical maneuver, it was a message, a narrative, a challenge to the very idea of security in Jerusalem. And once symbols are shaken, the ripple effects spread across borders, across populations, and across time. When a nation like Yemen, battered by years of conflict, strangled by economic blockade, and ravaged by humanitarian crisis, demonstrates the capacity to strike the heart of Jerusalem, the regional balance of power is shaken in ways that cannot be ignored. For decades, the assumption in the Middle East has been that military might advance defense systems and foreign backing determine who holds the upper hand. Yet, the barrage that landed on the municipal compound tells a different story, one where resource poor actors can disrupt the confidence of nations thought to be invulnerable. This is not only a battlefield event, but a tectonic shift in perception, and perception in geopolitics is often more influential than the reality itself. Here is the hook. If Yemen can reach Jerusalem, then the story of who is powerful and who is powerless must be rewritten. Every strike chips away at the image of invincibility that has long surrounded Israel. That image has been central not only to its deterrent strategy, but also to the confidence it projects to allies and adversaries alike. When missiles slip past defenses and land in symbolic centers of power, the psychological edge that comes with superiority begins to erode. And once the illusion of complete protection cracks, it cannot easily be repaired. The regional implications of this shift are profound. Neighboring states, many of whom calculate their security policies based on Israel's perceived strength, now have to reconsider their assumptions. If Yemen, with its limited resources, can achieve such penetration, then what might other actors with greater means and stronger alliances be capable of? The strategic map begins to blur. Governments that once felt secure under the umbrella of advanced defense technology now question whether that security is more fragile than advertised. The ripple effect spreads through military doctrines, diplomatic strategies, and alliance structures as each player recalibrates its position in light of this new reality. For Israel, the challenge is not only military, but reputational. Deterrence is as much about perception as it is about capability. The idea that enemies believe a strike is too costly or impossible to carry out has always been central to Israel's strategy. But the moment missiles land in Jerusalem, deterrence takes a hit. If enemies believe they can inflict damage, if they believe symbols of authority are reachable, then the deterrence equation is fundamentally altered. And once altered, it encourages further testing. This is the dangerous momentum of regional power shifts. One successful breach emboldens others, creating a cycle where escalation becomes more likely with each step. At the same time, Yemen's success changes the narrative for populations across the region. People who have long viewed the Middle East through the lens of overwhelming power imbalance now see evidence that resistance, no matter how disadvantaged, can challenge the powerful. This is a symbolic victory as much as a tactical one, and symbols carry immense weight in shaping collective attitudes. It tells the marginalized that even the strongest can be touched, and it tells the strong that their power has limits. The economic dimension cannot be overlooked either. Nations with fragile economies like Yemen often channel limited resources into asymmetric strategies, betting on psychological and political impact rather than sheer military dominance. By demonstrating reach into Jerusalem, Yemen has shifted the cost benefit analysis of regional conflict. Israel and its allies are forced to invest more heavily in defense, to allocate greater budgets toward protection, while Yemen spends relatively little to generate outsized results. This inversion of cost dynamics is itself a form of power shift because it drains the resources of the stronger side while validating the persistence of the weaker one. And here is another hook. Power in today's world is not measured only in tanks, jets, or missiles, but in the ability to unsettle expectations. When the expected narrative, Israel as untouchable, Yemen as powerless, is overturned, the entire region takes notice. Such moments become historical reference points, shaping how future conflicts are approached, how strategies are devised, and how leaders explain their choices to their people. The strike on Jerusalem's municipal compound is therefore more than a violent episode. It is a signal flare. It tells us that the balance of power in the Middle East is more dynamic, more unstable, and more susceptible to shock than many believed. It reminds us that strength is never absolute and that vulnerability, once revealed, changes the game for everyone watching. And as long as that shift in perception continues to ripple outward, the entire region must contend with the reality that power is not as fixed as it once seemed. When examining the fifth key point, the international political fallout of such an attack, we need to appreciate the scale of disruption that this missile barrage represents. A strike targeting the heart of Jerusalem, specifically the municipal compound, is not only a devastating physical blow, but a symbolic one. The world's political and religious centers have always held disproportionate influence on the global stage, and Jerusalem is no exception. To strike it directly is to touch a nerve in the international order, and the reverberations are immediate. Within hours, statements of condemnation, support, or calculated silence ripple across capitals, each reflecting not just outrage or concern, but also deeper geopolitical interests. For some nations, this attack becomes an opportunity to reaffirm solidarity with Israel. For others, it is a chance to criticize what they view as disproportionate responses or to highlight grievances long buried under diplomatic jargon. The fallout is not only military, but also diplomatic, a realignment of rhetoric, positions, and potential alliances. The United States inevitably finds itself at the center of this political storm. As Israel's closest ally, Washington faces enormous pressure to respond decisively, to issue assurances of continued support, and to back them up with concrete measures. Yet, this obligation collides with another reality. The United States is stretched thin, embroiled in multiple global crises, and aware of the fatigue within its own population regarding perpetual entanglements in foreign conflicts. Thus, policymakers find themselves wrestling with a dilemma: how to project strength and reliability without overextending already strained resources. Every word spoken by American officials is weighed carefully because the stakes are not just about one attack. They are about credibility, influence, and the balance of power in the Middle East. For adversaries, any sign of hesitation can be interpreted as weakness. For allies, any delay in response can be taken as betrayal. Meanwhile, regional actors play their roles with precision. Iran, often accused of supporting and supplying the Houthis, becomes the prime suspect in the background orchestration of such a sophisticated barrage. Tehran denies direct involvement, but the strategic message is clear: its influence is growing, its proxies are capable, and its rivals remain vulnerable. Saudi Arabia, which has long fought a bitter war against the Houthis, faces its own complications. On the one hand, Riyadh sees the attack as validation of its warnings about the danger posed by the Houthis. On the other hand, the possibility of escalating tensions threatens its fragile attempts at rapprochement with Iran and its aspirations for regional stability. Every move becomes a calculation between security and diplomacy, between asserting dominance and avoiding entrapment in a wider war. In Europe, reactions vary but share a common thread of concern. Nations like Germany, France, and the UK emphasize the importance of restraint, yet their responses are layered with contradictions. They condemn the attack, but also quietly question Israeli policies that contribute to endless cycles of violence. For European policymakers, the strike raises uncomfortable questions. Can they continue to advocate for peace while aligning militarily with one side? Can they afford to alienate Arab partners while keeping faith with Israel? These contradictions fuel debates within European capitals and reveal the cracks in what is often presented as a unified Western stance. At the same time, international institutions are thrust into the spotlight. The United Nations convenes emergency sessions, diplomats deliver impassioned speeches, and resolutions are drafted that will likely be watered down through compromise. Yet behind the theatrics of diplomacy lies a sobering reality: the UN, though symbolically important, often proves ineffective in moments of acute crisis. The veto powers of the Security Council shape outcomes less around justice or peace and more around the interests of powerful states. Thus, the international fallout exposes not only geopolitical divisions, but also the structural limitations of global governance. Perhaps most strikingly, this attack forces the world to confront the fragility of stability in the Middle East. For decades, leaders have spoken of peace processes, negotiations, and two-state solutions, yet the cycle of violence persists. The barrage on Jerusalem serves as a brutal reminder that unresolved grievances will not simply fade into history, they will resurface, often violently, until genuinely addressed. And here lies a hook we cannot ignore. The political fallout is not just about what governments say, but about what populations feel. Around the world, people are watching this unfold, drawing their own conclusions, forming their own narratives. In the age of digital media, the battlefield is not only on the ground, but also in the realm of perception. The story told about this attack, who is portrayed as aggressor and who as victim, will shape global politics as much as the missiles themselves. Thus, the international political fallout is layered, multidimensional, and ongoing. It is not confined to boardrooms or summits, but spills into public discourse, protest movements, and policy debates across continents. The targeting of Jerusalem ignites passions that cross borders and religions, and it forces nations to show where they stand when confronted with the inescapable question: in moments of violence, will they respond with escalation, with diplomacy, or with silence? That choice, repeated across capitals, becomes the true measure of the political fallout. When we turn to the sixth key point, the long-term consequences for the regional balance of power, we step into the deeper currents that shape the Middle East beyond the immediate headlines. A missile barrage on Jerusalem's municipal compound is not just another violent episode in a cycle of conflict. It is a moment that tilts the scales, however subtly, in the regional contest for dominance. For decades, the balance of power in the Middle East has been fragile, often described as a chessboard where one move by a player triggers a cascade of responses from others. This attack is such a move, forcing regional and global powers to reevaluate strategies, alliances, and vulnerabilities. The question becomes not just what happened, but what happens next? And the answer to that question has profound implications for years, perhaps decades to come. One of the most immediate shifts lies in the perception of non-state actors like the Houthis. A group often dismissed as a peripheral insurgency in Yemen has now demonstrated the capacity to strike the symbolic heart of Israel. That changes calculations. Suddenly, governments in the region and beyond can no longer afford to treat the Houthis as merely a localized threat. Their technological capabilities, the precision of their missile systems, and the strategic timing of their attacks elevate them into a category of actors that influence regional security far beyond Yemen's borders. This recognition unsettles established powers because it suggests that the monopoly of power traditionally held by states is eroding. The regional balance now includes players once considered outsiders, and that shift is both destabilizing and transformative. For Israel, this attack underscores a vulnerability it cannot ignore. Despite its advanced defense systems, its intelligence networks, and its reputation for military superiority, it was unable to prevent a direct strike on Jerusalem. This challenges not only Israel's sense of security, but also the perception among its allies that it remains invulnerable. In the regional balance of power, perception is as important as reality. If adversaries believe Israel can be struck, they will be emboldened. If allies believe Israel is less secure than it projects, their strategies will adapt accordingly. This subtle recalibration has ripple effects. It may embolden other groups, complicate Israel's deterrence posture, and pressure its leadership to demonstrate strength through actions that could either restore confidence or ignite further escalation. Meanwhile, Iran's influence looms large. Whether or not Tehran directly orchestrated this barrage, the attack feeds into its broader strategy of using proxy groups to extend its reach and undermine rivals. Each successful strike attributed, fairly or unfairly, to Iranian support reinforces the idea that Iran is the central architect of resistance in the region. This perception, whether fully accurate or not, enhances Iran's standing among sympathetic populations and elevates its leverage in regional negotiations. For Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf states, this is a sobering reminder of how easily the balance can tip. They are forced to decide. Do they align more closely with Israel and the West to counter this rising threat, or do they pursue new avenues of diplomacy with Iran to reduce tensions? Each choice reshapes the regional balance, and the weight of such decisions cannot be overstated. The United States, though geographically distant, is deeply entangled in this balance. Its military bases, its alliances, and its commitments make it a permanent player in the Middle East chessboard. A strike of this magnitude pressures Washington to reassess its posture. Can it continue with its pivot toward Asia while maintaining stability in the Middle East? Or will the growing capability of groups like the Houthis drag it deeper into conflicts it has tried to step back from? The perception of American resolve, or lack thereof, will reverberate through the calculations of allies and adversaries alike. If Washington is seen as unwilling to fully back Israel in times of vulnerability, others may question the reliability of American guarantees, altering their own security strategies in ways that weaken U.S. influence. Over time, the consequences also seep into the global energy market and trade routes, areas that are deeply tied to the regional balance of power. The Houthis control of parts of Yemen already threatens the Bab el Mandeb Strait, a crucial maritime choke point. With demonstrated missile capabilities reaching Jerusalem, the fear grows that shipping lanes, oil infrastructure, and other strategic assets across the region could be targeted next. That fear alone reshapes economic strategies, insurance rates, and investment flows. In the Middle East, economics and politics are inseparable, and the regional balance of power is increasingly influenced not just by who has more weapons, but by who can disrupt the flow of resources the world depends on. This is where the hook becomes unavoidable. What we are witnessing is not simply another flare up in a long conflict, but a reconfiguration of power itself. The old assumptions that states alone dictate outcomes, that Israel's defenses are unbreachable, that American support is an unshakable constant, are being tested. The long term consequences lie not in the rubble left behind by the missiles, but in the altered calculations in the minds of leaders, militaries, and populations across the region. Once the idea takes root that the balance has shifted even slightly, it can set off a chain of decisions that make the shift permanent. As I close, I want to leave you with this. The most violent Yemeni missile barrage targeting the heart of Jerusalem is not just another headline, it is a warning. It tells us that the longer we allow economic exploitation, political arrogance, and human desperation to fester, the more violent and unpredictable our world will become. And if we ignore this, if we dismiss it as just another flare up in the Middle East, then we are complicit in allowing the cycle of destruction to spiral even further. Remember, these wars don't end with victory parades. They end when the people, ordinary working people, decide that the cost of war is no longer worth the illusion of power. The real question isn't whether Jerusalem can rebuild its municipal compound. It's whether we, as a global society, can rebuild the trust, the justice, and the economic fairness necessary to prevent such missiles from ever being launched in the first place. Thank you.